They say loneliness is a curse, a shadow that follows you, whispering that you're not enough. That without constant connection, without the validation of others, you are incomplete. We are taught to fear solitude, to escape it at all costs, as if being alone is something unnatural, something to be fixed. But what if we've been misled? What if loneliness isn't the enemy, but a misunderstood state of being? In a world more connected than ever, why do so many people still feel isolated? Maybe the problem isn't solitude itself, but how we perceive it. Today, we're going to challenge everything you thought you knew about loneliness. Is it truly something to be feared? Or could it be a hidden source of strength, clarity, and transformation? Let's find out. Loneliness has always been painted as something negative, something to be avoided at all costs. Society has conditioned us to believe that being alone is synonymous with being unhappy, unfulfilled, or even broken. From childhood, we are taught that socializing is not just a part of life, but a requirement for happiness. The movies we watch, the songs we listen to, and the stories we hear all reinforce one idea. To be alone is to be incomplete. But where did this fear of loneliness come from? Part of it is biological. Humans are social creatures. Our ancestors relied on community for survival. Being isolated meant being vulnerable, an easy target for danger. Over time, this instinct to stay connected became hardwired into our psychology. We feel discomfort when we are alone because, in ancient times, being alone could mean life or death. However, the world has changed. We no longer live in small tribes where survival depends on constant interaction. Yet, the fear of loneliness remains deeply ingrained. Modern culture has amplified this fear even further. Social media bombards us with images of people surrounded by friends, having fun, and living seemingly perfect lives. The unspoken message is clear: if you are not constantly surrounded by people, something is wrong with you. But this belief is a myth. Being alone does not automatically mean being lonely. Some of the greatest minds in history, artists, philosophers, scientists, chose solitude, not because they were rejected by society, but because they found power in being alone. Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and even great writers like Virginia Woolf and Franz Kafka spent long periods in solitude not as a punishment, but as a way to think, create, and understand themselves on a deeper level. So why do we continue to believe that loneliness is inherently bad? The truth is, not all solitude is the same. There is a difference between being alone and feeling lonely. One is a physical state, the other is an emotional experience. You can be surrounded by people and still feel deeply lonely, just as you can be alone and feel completely at peace. The myth of loneliness isn't just that being alone is bad. It's the idea that we must constantly seek others to be happy. But what if we looked at loneliness differently? What if, instead of running from it, we tried to understand it? What if solitude wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace? If loneliness were truly a curse, why have some of the greatest minds in history willingly embraced it? Why do some people actively seek solitude instead of fearing it? The truth is, loneliness, when understood and used correctly, can be a powerful tool for personal growth, creativity, and self-discovery. The problem isn't loneliness itself, it's how we interpret it. For centuries, solitude has been a cornerstone of wisdom. Philosophers, monks, and spiritual leaders have sought isolation to gain deeper insights into life and the human mind. Buddha attained enlightenment in solitude. Nietzsche believed that greatness could only be achieved through moments of deep isolation. Even modern thinkers like Steve Jobs spoke about the necessity of being alone to truly innovate. These individuals didn't view loneliness as something to escape. They saw it as an opportunity to connect with themselves on a profound level. But beyond philosophy and history, science also supports the idea that solitude can be beneficial. Studies have shown that spending time alone enhances creativity, strengthens problem-solving skills, and even improves emotional regulation. When you are constantly surrounded by people, your mind is in a reactive state, responding to conversations, expectations, and social pressures. But in solitude, your brain has the space to reflect, process, and generate original thoughts. Many artists, writers, and inventors have created their best work while being alone. It is in these quiet moments that ideas form, that personal breakthroughs happen. Loneliness also forces us to confront ourselves. In social settings, it's easy to distract ourselves with noise, with other people's opinions, with endless conversations that prevent deep introspection. But when you are alone, there is nowhere to hide. You are left with your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, your true self. This can be uncomfortable, even painful, but it is necessary. True self-awareness doesn't come from external validation. It comes from sitting with yourself, understanding your emotions, and learning to be at peace with who you are. Of course, this doesn't mean that prolonged isolation is always healthy. There is a fine line between solitude and loneliness, between enjoying your own company and feeling disconnected from the world. The key is balance. Just as too much socialization can lead to exhaustion, too much isolation can lead to emotional distress. The goal is not to reject relationships, but to recognize that you don't need them to define your self-worth. So instead of fearing loneliness, what if we embraced it? What if we used it as a tool for growth rather than a burden to carry? The world tells us that happiness is found in constant connection, but maybe, just maybe, the deepest form of peace is found in learning to be alone without feeling lonely. While solitude can be powerful, it is also a double-edged sword. There is a fine line between choosing to be alone and feeling trapped in isolation. Not all forms of loneliness are beneficial. When prolonged and unwanted, loneliness can become destructive, leading to emotional distress, mental health struggles, and even physical health risks. Psychologists have long studied the effects of chronic loneliness, and the results are alarming. Studies show that long-term loneliness increases the risk of depression, anxiety, and even cognitive decline. Some research suggests that loneliness can be as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, weakening the immune system and increasing the risk of heart disease. Humans may not need constant social interaction, but we do need meaningful connections. Without them, loneliness transforms from a moment of introspection into a state of suffering. But why does loneliness affect us so deeply? The answer lies in how our brains are wired. From an evolutionary perspective, being alone for extended periods signals danger. Our ancestors relied on social bonds for survival. Being part of a group meant protection, food, and shelter. In contrast, isolation often meant vulnerability. That ancient instinct still exists today, which is why extreme loneliness can trigger stress responses in the body, leading to increased levels of cortisol and inflammation. The real danger of loneliness is when it becomes self-perpetuating. People who feel lonely often withdraw further, making it harder to form new connections. The fear of rejection grows stronger, and over time, loneliness becomes a habit rather than a temporary state. This is when solitude stops being empowering and turns into a psychological prison. So how do we prevent loneliness from becoming harmful? The key is balance and self-awareness. Choosing solitude for reflection and creativity is different from being isolated against your will. If loneliness begins to feel overwhelming, it's important to take small steps toward connection. Whether that means reaching out to a friend, joining a community, or even engaging in activities that bring joy and fulfillment. Loneliness is not inherently bad, but like anything in life, too much of it can become dangerous. The challenge is not to eliminate loneliness completely, but to understand when it serves you and when it harms you. Learning to walk this fine line is what separates solitude as a strength from loneliness as a burden.